I'm Gabriel, and this is The Rare Mind. Today we're mapping the 8 unexpected stages every INFJ walks through, from that early sense of being out of place to the final moment of embracing their rare identity. Stay with me, because by the end you'll see how these stages aren't random struggles, but stepping stones to a deeper purpose. The INFJ path begins in silence. It is a life shaped less by external noise and more by the slow fire of inner vision. From an early age, solitude forms the architecture of their identity, not as loneliness, but as a necessary condition for clarity. The INFJ stands at the margins of common rhythms, listening to the pulse of what others dismiss, reading what lies between gestures and words. Their solitude is not absence, but concentration. This is why their journey so often feels different from the majority. While the world rewards speed, they move according to depth. The majority seeks consensus, but INFJs are compelled by alignment with truth. There is a dissonance here, a subtle ache of walking through life as if one's compass pointed to a star invisible to most. Sometimes I feel this ache like a weight in my chest, an awareness that I cannot pretend not to see what I see. To live in such a state is to carry the constant sensation of being out of sync with society. Conversations skim the surface. Institutions demand masks. And the INFJ finds themselves wondering if the fault is theirs or if the world has lost its language for silence. The sensation is not merely social awkwardness but an ontological gap. They are tuned to a different frequency, and in the static between frequencies arises the quiet pain of misrecognition. Yet, this misalignment becomes the soil of deeper meaning. For an INFJ, identity is not satisfied with external roles or borrowed narratives. They must seek the essence hidden beneath appearance, the pattern beneath chaos. Their rarity is inseparable from this hunger, to see, to unveil, to discern. Meaning where others perceive only accident. The INFJ path is not about superiority, but about necessity. Without meaning, existence feels hollow. With it, even suffering becomes luminous. What then? Is this journey if not a map? A chart for those who wander at the edges of common paths, unsure whether their difference is curse or calling. To walk this road is to learn that solitude is not abandonment, but initiation. That vision is not madness, but direction. And that to be rare is not to be lost, but to be summoned. The INFJ path does not promise ease, but it does reveal stages, a sequence of thresholds through which strangeness becomes identity, and identity becomes destiny. Sometimes the light flickers. Sometimes it just hurts. But I know this. The rare path, though narrow, is real. And for those who walk it, the question is not whether they will find meaning, but when. Childhood for an INFJ often begins with a faint but persistent sense of displacement. The room is full. Laughter circles the air, yet something in them lingers at the threshold, unable to belong. They feel as if the script handed out to others never quite fits their lines. This early awareness is not yet articulated in words, but it is lived in the body. A pause before joining, a glance that scans for meaning while others simply play. Sensitivity sharpens this awareness. What another child shrugs off, the INFJ absorbs like water into soil. A cruel word echoes for days, while a moment of kindness roots itself deeply, shaping trust. This heightened perception can wound, but it also refines wisdom. Pain becomes a tutor, carving out depth where others skim across surfaces. I still remember the sharp sting of voices mocking what I cared about. It pierced me, but it also taught me where truth begins. Kierkegaard once wrote of the single individual standing before God and world. This notion mirrors the INFJ's experience. Existence feels deeply personal, as if no crowd could absorb their responsibility. From the outside, such solitude may appear tragic, yet within it lies dignity, the recognition that identity is not conferred by the masses, but wrestled into being through silence and choice. Still, the struggle is acute. INFJs often experience invisibility, their inner wealth hidden beneath quiet demeanor. They ache to be seen, not in performance, but in essence. This ache shapes a paradox. They long for recognition yet resist compromising what is most true. In contrast, INTJs sense their outsider role differently. Where the INFJ feels it as wound, the INTJ often reframes it as advantage, an elevated position from which to design, plan, and anticipate. And so, in these early awakenings of difference, two paths form under the same sky. For the INFJ, the challenge is to endure invisibility without losing faith in their vision. For the INTJ, the task is to wield their separateness as strategy without severing their human need for connection. In both cases, being out of place is not a flaw but a foundation. What seems exile becomes the beginning of vocation. The night was quiet except for the hum of a distant refrigerator. I sat on the floor, books scattered around me, and felt both small and immense. In that moment, I knew difference was not an accident, it was a call. I want to hear from you. Which stage felt the most familiar so far? The hidden conflict with the world, or that turning point when purpose becomes urgent? Drop it in the comments, and if you've got a phrase that anchors you in that stage, write it down. I'll be reading and maybe even highlighting some in the next video. Isn't it true that the very wound of being different is also the seed of becoming whole? There is a moment in the rare journey when speech withdraws and the eyes take over. For many INFJs, this begins in youth. A tendency to step back, to linger at the margins of a room, absorbing more than participating. What looks like shyness is often apprenticeship. They are rehearsing the art of listening, storing fragments of tone, gesture, and silence that others discard. The INFJ is learning, without knowing it, to see through surfaces. This stage of watching is not passive. Each quiet hour builds empathy. Each unnoticed detail sharpens discernment. By restraining themselves from constant action, INFJs grow into a hidden intimacy with others' inner lives. They see the cracks in masks, the shadows behind laughter, the fractures in certainty. I have often found myself silent at gatherings, hearing what was not said louder than the words that filled the air. That silence was not emptiness, it was sight. Kierkegaard once reflected on inwardness as the site where truth unfolds. This mirrors the INFJ stage of observation. Their inner life is not an escape but a crucible, a place where impressions ferment into meaning. To dwell inwardly while the world runs outward is not avoidance but alignment with a deeper tempo. Observation becomes revelation. From this vantage, INFJs detect patterns invisible to most. They connect the scattered dots of human behavior into constellations of insight. A single sigh, a glance downward, a shift in cadence. These become signals that sketch the architecture of another's soul. INTJs, too, lean on silent observation, though their energy bends towards structure. What for the INFJ becomes empathy, for the INTJ crystallizes into systems and strategies. Silence feeds them both, though it flowers differently. And so the Chismas stage of silent observation is less a pause than a foundation. It is the hidden apprenticeship that prepares both INFJ and INTJ for the rare roles they will later embody. The stillness of watching becomes the seedbed of action. Without it, their vision would collapse under shallowness. With it, they carry within themselves the quiet authority of those who have truly seen. One night, the rain tapped against my window in uneven rhythms. I sat without words, tracing the sound, feeling how each drop belonged to a larger pattern. That was when I understood. Silence is not empty. Silence is alive. What if the act of watching is itself the first form of creation? To carry a rare interior life is to invite misinterpretation. The INFJ, whose depth is often invisible on the surface, can be misread as aloof, detached, or even cold. Their silence, born of observation, appears to others as distance. But within that silence burns an intensity that words cannot immediately convey. The world, impatient with what it cannot see, stamps them with labels that do not fit. INTJs know this same fate, but they meet it with a different armor. Where the INFJ internalizes misunderstanding, allowing it to bruise their sense of belonging, the INTJ converts it into fuel for independence. Logic becomes their shield, precision their language, autonomy their defense. I have felt both impulses in myself, the sting of being misread and the temptation to retreat into cold clarity. Neither is the whole truth, but both are responses to the same wound. Kierkegaard spoke of despair as the sickness of not being oneself. Misunderstanding can ferment such despair. The INFJ begins to wonder if their strangeness is proof of defect, while the INTJ risks hardening into an identity defined only by resistance. The tension here is not simply social, it is existential. To be unseen for who you are is to feel a fracture between essence and appearance. If when I described that childhood awareness of feeling different, you thought, that was me, let me know by hitting the like button. It tells me this journey is resonating with you, and it helps me bring more of these honest, rare reflections right when you need them. For the INFJ, rejection too easily confirms their suspicion of being irredeemably different. They withdraw further, confusing solitude with exile. Their gift becomes buried under self-doubt, their compassion silenced by fear of irrelevance. For the INTJ, the rejection often stiffens. Resolve. They rely on competence, systems, and intellect to assert their worth, distancing themselves from vulnerability. Where the INFJ bleeds inward, the INTJ builds walls outward. Yet both responses reveal the same truth. Being misunderstood is heavy to bear. It isolates the very core of identity, tempting one to either dissolve into invisibility or ossify into control. And yet perhaps the burden is also an invitation. For in carrying misunderstanding without losing oneself, the rare individual learns endurance. They discover that true identity cannot depend on constant recognition, but must be rooted in a deeper source. The room was lit only by a single lamp, shadows bending along the walls. I felt unseen, though surrounded by people. In that moment, I realized misunderstanding is not the end of identity, it is the test of it. How else could the rare path prove itself, if not through the fire of being misread? There comes a point when difference can no longer remain. Background noise. For the INFJ, and equally for the INTJ, the ache of misalignment with the world sharpens into a demand. Life must mean something. What once was tolerated as strangeness now becomes unbearable unless transformed into vocation. The call to purpose does not arrive politely. It intrudes like a sudden silence after thunder, pressing the soul to answer. This urgency mirrors Kierkegaard's image of the leap of faith, a decisive crossing into the unknown, where reason alone cannot guarantee footing. For the INFJ, the leap often takes the form of surrender to roles of healing, guiding, or giving voice to the invisible currents of human experience. They sense that their sensitivity was not meant for self-preservation alone, but for communion, for restoration. I have felt this moment like fire in my chest. When I could no longer remain an observer, I had to step forward. The INTJ too hears this call, but it bends differently. For them, purpose crystallizes as the design of systems, missions, or structures that endure. Where the INFJ longs to mend hearts and meaning, the INTJ seeks to build frameworks that make new futures possible. Their call is not less spiritual for being strategic. It is simply translated into architecture rather than empathy. What unites them both is the necessity of inner alignment. Neither INFJ nor INTJ can live long in roles that betray their core. External rewards collapse into ash if they are severed from inner truth. The world may clamor with opportunities, but until they find resonance within, their actions remain hollow. This is why their lives often appear delayed. They will not commit fully until the path is authentically theirs. The call to purpose, then, is not about ambition but about truth. It is the voice that says, "Live no longer divided." The INFJ must embody compassion without erasing themselves. The INTJ must pursue mastery without losing humanity. Both must learn that purpose is not imposed from outside, but revealed through fidelity to the inner compass. I remember once standing in the half-light of dawn, city still asleep, and feeling the certainty rise within me, "I cannot waste my life." That sentence was not mine alone, it was purpose itself speaking through me. And so the rare path sharpens. Will we obey the weight of truth within, or dissolve into the convenience of the crowd? To walk with rare vision is to carry a double life. On the surface, INFJs often wear masks of ease and sociability, disguising the ocean beneath. They learn early that revealing their full depth can overwhelm others, so they ration it carefully. But this masking, meant for survival, slowly eats away at authenticity. The quiet conflict grows. How much of myself must I hide in order to belong? Notice how, in the stage of silent observation, INFJs are quietly absorbing what others miss. That's exactly the kind of nuance we unpack here every week. If that speaks to you, subscribe now so you don't just hear labels about INFJs, but actually understand the living process behind them. INTJs face the same tension, though their strategy differs. They conceal not depth, but vulnerability. To maintain control, they fortify their image with logic and competence, crafting a fortress of independence. Yet beneath the armor lies the same fear, that to be seen unguarded would invite rejection or exploitation. I have felt this in myself, the reflex to hide tenderness behind clarity, to present reason when what I carried was ache. Kierkegaard warned of the crowd as the enemy of the single individual. Here, the insight cuts sharply. Both INFJs and INTJs wrestle with a world that rewards conformity while punishing singularity. To preserve their essence, they must choose between erasure and isolation. Neither option feels bearable. The result is an invisible conflict, a battle waged in silence beneath the appearance of composure. For the INFJ, this conflict often manifests as self-erasure. They soften their words, shrink their vision, and sacrifice truth to maintain harmony. What looks like peace is often quiet suffocation. For the INTJ, the battle tilts toward isolation. Their standards, uncompromising and exacting, drive them further from connection. What looks like strength can conceal loneliness. And yet, within this conflict lies a strange alchemy. The very tension between inner truth and outer demand forges resilience. To navigate between masks and solitude is to learn which parts of the self are non-negotiable. The hidden war refines clarity even as it wounds. Sometimes, the wound itself becomes the teacher. One evening, I sat in a cafe, the low hum of conversation filling the air, while I felt entirely apart. The mask was on, I smiled, nodded, but inside I burned with the question, what is left of me if I keep hiding? Is it not true that the world's pressure to conform only sharpens the necessity of becoming fully oneself? There comes a threshold where endurance breaks. After years of adapting, concealing, and translating themselves into more palatable forms, both INFJ and INTJ arrive at rebellion. It is not loud, not violent, but inward a quiet refusal to keep living a divided life. This rebellion does not announce itself in speeches. It unfolds in decisions. The slow withdrawal of energy from false obligations, the silent tearing down of masks. For the INFJ, the rebellion is deeply relational. They begin reclaiming the right to bring their true self into connection. Where once they silenced their vision for the sake of harmony, they now risk speaking with clarity. Relationships may fracture under this weight, yet authenticity demands it. I remember telling someone close to me a truth I had long hidden. It cost me their approval, but it gave me back my soul. For the INTJ, rebellion takes the shape of decisive independence. Tired of bending to mediocrity or suffocating under compromised systems, they choose to stand apart even if it means solitude. Their rebellion is an act of sovereignty, a declaration that they will architect life according to their own principles, no longer shackled by borrowed scripts. Kierkegaard described authenticity as the antidote to despair, and this stage embodies that truth. To rebel inwardly is to begin living outwardly without contradiction. The INFJ finds that honesty in relationships is not cruelty but liberation. The INTJ discovers that independence is not withdrawal but fidelity to their inner law. In both, rebellion is less about breaking the world and more about refusing to betray the self. And though the process is costly, its fruits are undeniable. With each risk taken, identity regains its strength. With each mask removed, breath returns. What once felt like exile now begins to taste like freedom. The night was silent except for the ticking of a clock on my desk. In that sound, steady and inescapable, I realized time was not waiting for me to live as myself. Isn't every true rebellion, in the end, simply the choice to stop abandoning who we are? Solitude, once endured as exile, becomes the crucible where rare souls are remade. What once felt like abandonment begins to glow with hidden promise. In solitude, distractions fall away, and the self is forced to face its own depth. For the INFJ, this turning point often feels like a homecoming. Silence no longer crushes them but welcomes them. Reflection becomes prayer, and their solitude expands into a spiritual dialogue with existence itself. When we reach the transformation through solitude, you'll see how it quietly reshapes everything. If you want to catch that moment the second it drops and not miss the final stage of integration, turn on notifications. That way, this rare map finds you right when you're ready to use it. The INTJ too discovers solitude as power, though their shaping takes another form. Instead of reflection, they channel isolation into disciplined creation. They sketch systems, draft strategies, refine visions that could never be born in the clamor of the crowd. Their solitude is a workshop, as rigorous as it is liberating. I have known this space intimately. Hours spent alone at my desk, the world outside forgotten as clarity sharpens into form. Kierkegaard once insisted that solitude is the necessary condition for truth. In these rare types, the statement proves itself. Without solitude, the INFJ drowns in the demands of others. Without solitude, the INTJ suffocates in mediocrity. Both need the silence, not as retreat from life, but as transformation for it. Solitude is no longer punishment, but preparation. The furnace of solitude reshapes identity. The INFJ, once afraid of being unseen, learns to anchor themselves in presence beyond validation. They discover that empathy need not be endless sacrifice, but a light that must be tended at its source. The INTJ, once hardened by their standards, begins to recognize that creation is not control but stewardship. Their solitude softens into strength, clarity joined with humility. And when both emerge, they carry with them something unbreakable. Their solitude has burned away illusions. What remains is essence uncluttered, resilient, radiant. They return to the world not as fragmented exiles, but as whole individuals who know the weight of their truth. One morning, the room was still, filled only with the smell of coffee rising from my cup. I felt no loneliness, no ache, only presence. In that quiet, I realized solitude had stopped wounding me. It had begun to shape me. What if the silence we fear is the very soil where our truest self takes root? Solitude ripens into responsibility. What was once hidden inside now presses to be shared, not out of vanity, but necessity. The INFJ feels this as a calling to guide, to mentor, to lift others from the shadows they themselves once knew. Their insights, once buried in journals or unspoken reflections, begin to find voice. They discover that healing is not only possible but demanded. Their empathy, once a private burden, becomes a gift offered to others. For the INTJ, contribution takes on a different form. Their solitude yields blueprints, strategies, and systems that reach beyond themselves. Where the INFJ tends souls, the INTJ builds legacies. They see structures failing, futures endangered, and step into leadership not to dominate, but to design. Their contribution is less a hand extended to one person than an architecture meant for many. I have felt the pull of both currents, the urge to speak to a single soul in need, and the hunger to reshape a wider horizon. Kierkegaard suggested that authentic living requires choosing responsibility. This stage reflects that demand. The INFJ can no longer stay hidden in private visions. The INTJ can no longer hoard strategies for their own survival. Contribution redeems the earlier years of invisibility and exile. What felt like wasted suffering reveals itself as preparation, the soil, from which purpose now flowers. And yet, contribution is not explanation. They do not need to justify their difference or prove their worth to the crowd. Purpose becomes visible only in action. For the INFJ, this might be a word spoken at the right moment, a presence that awakens another to their own dignity. For the INTJ, it might be the system built, the innovation launched, the mission articulated with clarity. Both find their meaning not in being understood, but in being effective. The air was thick with the smell of rain after a summer storm. I walked outside, barefoot on wet ground, and felt the truth surge in me. My pain was no longer just mine. It had to serve. Isn't it only when we give ourselves away that the weight of our solitude finally turns into light? The rare journey does not end in conquest, but in reconciliation. After solitude, rebellion, and contribution, both INFJ and INTJ reach a stage where fragmentation yields to wholeness. Here, the inner self no longer fights to prove itself, nor hides in fear of misunderstanding. Instead, there is acceptance. The path was always meant to be different, and difference was always meant to bear fruit. For the INFJ, this integration means weaving empathy with boundaries. No longer drained by the urge to save everyone, they learn to give without dissolving. Compassion remains their compass, but it is guided now by discernment. They realize that to preserve their light, they must honor the vessel that carries it. I have tasted this shift in myself, the relief of saying no without betrayal, the freedom of letting my care be precise instead of endless. For the INTJ, integration comes as mastery tempered by humility. Their vision remains sharp, their strategies intact, but arrogance softens into wisdom. They learn that systems, however brilliant, exist for people, not the other way around. Their strength matures into stewardship, a form of power that sustains rather than dominates. Kierkegaard's notion of becoming oneself frames this final stage. Integration is not perfection but fidelity, the courage to live outwardly what has always burned inwardly. Pain and solitude are no longer enemies, but ingredients of a rare clarity. Both INFJ and INTJ emerge with an identity both firm and flexible, unyielding in essence, adaptable in expression. When we get into the burden of misunderstanding, you might immediately think of someone close to you who's constantly misread as distant when they're just deep. Share this video with them. Sometimes one honest map can change how they see themselves and how others see them. The world may still misunderstand them, but misunderstanding no longer wounds as it once did. Their worth is rooted deeper now, beyond the need for constant recognition. Their rarity, once carried as a burden, becomes a source of quiet strength. Contribution flows naturally, not forced, because it arises from an integrated center. One evening, the golden light of sunset stretched across my desk, touching the worn edges of a book I had carried for years. In that glow, I felt it clearly. Nothing had been wasted. Every wound, every silence, every rebellion had been part of becoming whole. And so the rare path closes, not with arrival, but with return. To be rare is no longer to be lost. It is to be found in the truth of oneself finally lived.